What does it sound like when one person controls the fate of 40 aircraft across 200,000 square miles of hostile airspace? On January 17, 1991, at 0300 hours local time, Captain Mike Kimo Knapp sat in the dim blue glow of a 9-inch radar scope aboard an E-3B Sentry orbiting in a racetrack pattern over northern Saudi Arabia. His official title was Weapons Director. His actual job was something closer to air traffic controller, chess player, and combat tactician fused into a single headset. The aircraft, call sign Cougar, was one of 5 AWACS birds airborne that night, and Knapp's sector covered the western Iraqi border where coalition strike packages were streaming north toward Baghdad. He had been on station for 4 hours already. The war was 20 minutes old. The scope showed everything. Iraqi MiG-29s scrambling from Taqaddum. Coalition F-15Cs from the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron pushing north on combat air patrol. EF-111. Ravens jamming Iraqi ground radars. Tankers stacked at their white anchor points. F-117s, invisible to Iraqi radar, but broadcasting transponder codes visible only to AWACS, threading through gaps in the air defense network that Knapp and his fellow controllers had helped choreograph weeks earlier. On that single display, friendly and hostile returns moved in patterns that would have been incomprehensible noise to anyone without months of training. To Knapp, it was a living map of the war's opening act. Captain Steve Tate, an F-15C pilot from the 71st Tactical Fighter Squadron flying out of Dhahran, was one of the voices on Knapp's frequency. Tate would later describe the AWACS controller's calls as the voice of God in interviews with aviation journalist Steve Davies for his book F-15C Eagle Units of Desert Storm. The description stuck, and other pilots adopted it independently. The reason was simple. AWACS could see what the fighters couldn't. The F-15C's APG-63 radar was powerful but narrow, a flashlight beam in a dark warehouse. AWACS was the overhead fluorescent that lit the whole building. When a weapons director called out a bandit's bearing, range, altitude, and heading, the fighter pilot could point his nose, lock on, and shoot. Without that call, the pilot was searching blind, burning fuel in circles, hoping his own radar swept across something before something found him. That night, Tate got his vector. He fired an AIM-7M Sparrow and killed an Iraqi Mirage F-1. It was among the first air-to-air kills of the war. The engagement from AWACS call-out to missile impact lasted less than 90 seconds. The routine intercept is worth pausing on for a reason that had nothing to do with Tate's flying. By every peacetime metric that mattered to Congress, the aircraft making it possible was a failure. The E-3 Sentry program had been savaged for 2 decades before Desert Storm. A 1982 Government Accounting Office report called the fleet's mission-capable rate unacceptable, noting that the aircraft averaged 44 maintenance man-hours per flight hour, roughly 4 times the rate of a KC-135 tanker using the same 707 airframe. Senator William Proxmire, who made a second career out of attacking defense procurement, awarded Boeing a Golden Fleece Award in 1978 for the AWACS program's cost overruns, which had pushed the unit price from $71 million to over $150 million per copy. The radar, Westinghouse's AN/APY-1, demanded cooling systems so finicky that maintenance crews called the aircraft the Hangar Queen, without affection. Even inside the Air Force, tactical fighter pilots dismissed AWACS as a lumbering target that would last about 15 minutes in a real war against Soviet fighters. A 1985 RAND Corporation study on NATO air defense questioned whether the E-3 fleet could sustain the sortie rates needed for a European conflict lasting more than 72 hours. So the question that hung over Saudi Arabia in January 1991 was not whether AWACS worked in theory. The Air Force had been arguing that case since 1977. The question was whether an aircraft that couldn't stay out of the maintenance shop could stay in the air long enough to run a war, and whether 34 operational E-3s, the entire worldwide inventory, could generate enough orbits to provide continuous coverage across a theater the size of Western Europe. Could the most expensive radar platform ever built justify a procurement saga that had embarrassed the Pentagon for 15 years? 42 days later, the Air Force had its answer. It rewrote how America fights wars. Colonel Gordon Blake slammed a classified briefing folder onto a desk at Air Force Systems Command Headquarters in the autumn of 1963 and told his staff they had a problem that radars couldn't solve yet. The problem was the ground. Specifically, the ground's tendency to blind every airborne radar the United States had ever built. Existing early warning aircraft, like the EC-121 Warning Star, could track bombers flying at high altitude against open sky, where a target's radar return stood out clean against empty space. But when an enemy aircraft dropped below 5,000 feet, its radar signature merged with the returns bouncing off terrain, roads, buildings, rivers, a seething mass of energy called ground clutter that turned radar screens into useless static. The Soviets knew this. Their tactical doctrine for a European war assumed low-altitude penetration under the NATO radar fence. Every year, the problem got worse as Soviet aircraft got faster and lower. Vietnam made the theoretical crisis tangible. The Air Force's ground-based radar control network in Southeast Asia, a system of mobile TPQ-10 and TPS-43 stations scattered across South Vietnam and Thailand, was supposed to provide the same kind of vectoring that AWACS would later deliver. It didn't. The stations were fixed, vulnerable to attack, limited in range by terrain masking, and plagued by coordination failures between sites. Controllers at one station often couldn't see what controllers 80 miles away were tracking. During Operation Bolo in January 1967, Colonel Robin Olds and the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing pulled off the war's most famous aerial ambush of North Vietnamese MiG-29s, largely by ignoring the ground-based control network and relying on their own planning. Gaps in radar coverage overlapped with latency in the control network, leaving seams that MiGs flew through routinely. The Air Force's answer took shape under a program name that sounded deliberately boring: Overland Radar Technology, or ORT. Launched in 1966 under the direction of the Air Force Electronic Systems Division at Hanscom Field, Massachusetts, ORT's mandate was blunt: build an airborne radar that could look down at the Earth and still distinguish a moving aircraft from the clutter beneath it. The physics involved were murderous. A conventional pulse radar sends out energy and listens for echoes. When pointed at the ground from 30,000 feet, it gets back millions of echoes, every tree, every truck, every ridgeline, reflecting energy simultaneously. Picking a single aircraft out of that noise is like hearing one conversation in a stadium during a touchdown. Two competing contractors took separate approaches. Hughes Aircraft proposed a pulse Doppler radar that filtered returns by velocity. Since the ground is stationary relative to an aircraft flying at 400 knots, anything moving at aircraft speed could be isolated. Westinghouse proposed a similar pulse Doppler design but with a different antenna architecture. A rotating rotodome mounted above the fuselage, spinning 6 times per minute, providing 360-degree azimuth coverage, rather than the fixed forward-looking array Hughes favored. Boeing won the airframe competition in July 1970, proposing a modified 707-320B commercial airframe, the same basic fuselage already flying for dozens of airlines worldwide. The selection was pragmatic rather than glamorous. The 707 offered a proven pressurized cabin large enough to hold 13 operator consoles, a flight endurance exceeding 8 hours without refueling, and a global logistics chain that already existed. Spare engines, hydraulic pumps, landing gear assemblies, all of it sat on shelves at commercial maintenance depots from New York to Tokyo. The Air Force designated the aircraft EC-137D for the prototype phase. 2 airframes were built, one carrying the Hughes radar, one carrying the Westinghouse design. The fly-off happened over the American Southwest in 1972, and the results were decisive. Both radars could detect aircraft against ground clutter at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles, and maritime tracking worked on each system as well. But Westinghouse's AN/APY-1, with its 30-foot rotating rotodome, offered something Hughes couldn't match: the ability to scan in every direction simultaneously while maintaining track on over 600 targets. Hughes's fixed array required mechanical steering to shift coverage sectors, creating blind spots during transitions. The General Accounting Office's 1973 evaluation of the fly-off, declassified in full only in 1991, noted that the Westinghouse radar maintained track continuity on low-altitude targets at ranges where the Hughes system exhibited unacceptable track drop rates. Westinghouse 1. The production radar would be designated AN/APY-1, later upgraded to AN/APY-2, and it would define the E-3 Sentry for the next 4 decades. What emerged from those test flights was an aircraft that looked absurd and performed like nothing else in any inventory on Earth. A commercial airliner with a 30-foot black disc bolted to its back on 2 struts, cruising at 29,000 feet at a lumbering 360 knots, unable to maneuver, unable to fight, unable to hide, unable to do anything except orbit and watch. It carried no weapons. Its sole defensive system was the assumption that friendly fighters would keep threats away. The Air Force ordered 34 of them at a final unit cost that made the Senate Appropriations Committee physically uncomfortable. And the radar, the revolutionary, clutter-defeating, look-down pulse Doppler masterpiece that justified the entire program, required a cooling system so complex that maintenance crews at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma would spend the next 15 years learning to hate it with professional dedication. Sergeant First Class David Merriman was elbow-deep in a liquid cooling module at Tinker Air Force Base on a Tuesday afternoon in 1984, when the ethylene glycol line he was reseating cracked and sprayed green coolant across the avionics bay floor, shorting out a $40,000 signal data converter in the process. The AN/APY-1 radar's transmitter generated so much heat that it required its own dedicated cooling loop, separate from the aircraft's environmental control system, running chilled liquid through channels machined to tolerances tighter than anything on the 707 airframe itself. When that cooling system worked, the radar worked. When it didn't, and it frequently didn't, the entire aircraft was grounded. Merriman, a radar technician with the 552nd Airborne Warning and Control Wing, would later tell Air Force maintenance historian James Hearn that he spent more time fixing the cooling system than the radar itself. The radar was brilliant, he said. The plumbing was from hell. The numbers backed him up with uncomfortable precision. By 1983, the E-3 fleet was averaging a mission-capable rate of 57%, meaning that on any given day, 43% of the fleet was broken, being repaired or waiting for parts. For context, the F-15 Eagle, during the same period, held a mission-capable rate above 76% while operating from austere forward bases. The E-3 flew from fixed installations with full depot support and still couldn't keep 6 out of 10 jets flyable. The 552nd AWCW at Tinker maintained detailed logs, and the pattern was consistent. Radar cooling failures, rotodome drive mechanism faults, and avionics power supply burnouts accounted for over 60% of all unscheduled maintenance. Each rotodome removal, necessary for major radar repairs, required a crane, a specialized dolly, and 72 hours of labor by a crew of 12. The rotodome alone weighed over 6 tons. Congress noticed. Representative Les Aspin, then chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, called the E-3's maintenance record a procurement cautionary tale during a 1985 hearing on tactical air programs. His staff had compiled a comparison showing that the E-3 cost $18,900 per flight hour to operate, versus $7,200 for the KC-135 Stratotanker sharing the same basic airframe. The difference was almost entirely the radar and its support systems. Aspin's committee wasn't arguing that airborne early warning was unnecessary. The concept had proven itself since World War II. The argument was about whether this particular implementation was sustainable. "We are spending more to maintain 34 AWACS aircraft," Aspin told the committee, "than the Navy spends to maintain its entire E-2C Hawkeye fleet of 75 aircraft." The E-2C Grumman's carrier-based early warning platform carried a less powerful radar with shorter range, but it held a mission-capable rate above 72% and cost roughly a third as much per flight hour. The Navy made this comparison at every opportunity, and not subtly. By the mid-1980s, the case against AWACS had sharper edges. Ground-based radar was getting better. The Air Force's own AN/T PS-43 tactical radar had been upgraded with moving target indicator capability, partially solving the clutter problem that had justified AWACS in the first place. Meanwhile, reconnaissance satellites were improving at a rate that made some Pentagon analysts question whether a manned, orbiting radar platform was already obsolete. A 1986 Defense Science Board study on tactical surveillance architectures, portions of which remain classified, reportedly recommended shifting investment towards space-based radar and ground-based sensor fusion, rather than continuing to pour money into AWACS upgrades. The study's unclassified summary used the phrase diminishing marginal returns to describe additional E-3 investment, which, in Pentagon budget language, is the polite version of calling something a waste. Even AWACS advocates inside the Air Force struggled with the cost reality. The Block 30/35 upgrade program, intended to replace the E-3's original IBM CC-1 mission computers with faster CC-2 processors and add the Joint Tactical Information Distribution System for secure data linking, was budgeted at $2.7 billion across the fleet for 34 aircraft. That works out to roughly $79 million per jet just for the avionics refresh, more than the original unit cost of the airframe when it rolled off Boeing's line in Renton, Washington. General Robert Russ, commander of Tactical Air Command from 1985 to 1991, defended the expenditure in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1988. But his language was revealing. He called AWACS essential but unaffordable at current readiness levels, a formulation that managed to simultaneously justify the program and condemn its execution. By the summer of 1990, the E-3 Sentry existed in a bureaucratic purgatory familiar to anyone who has watched the Pentagon operate. Too expensive to love and too broken to trust, but too important to cancel and too capable to replace. The fleet had absorbed billions in upgrades and still couldn't sustain the sortie rates that NATO war plans demanded. Critics had a decade of Government Accounting Office reports and RAND studies on their side, plus enough congressional testimony to fill a shelf. The satellite advocates had momentum. The Navy had a cheaper alternative and wasn't shy about saying so. Then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and 34 maintenance nightmares became the most important aircraft in the theater. The heat hit the maintenance crews first. Riyadh in August averages 109 degrees Fahrenheit on the ramp, and the E-3's avionics bays, already the most temperature-sensitive spaces on any aircraft in the Air Force inventory, became ovens within 20 minutes of engine shutdown. Ground power carts struggled to keep the cooling systems running between sorties. Crew chiefs draped reflective blankets over the rotodome to keep the fiberglass skin from warping, a field expedient that appeared in no technical manual and was invented on the spot by a staff sergeant whose name nobody bothered to write down. The first E-3 touched down at Riyadh Air Base on August 8, 1990, 6 days after Iraqi armor rolled into Kuwait City. Within 2 weeks, the 552nd AWCW had deployed 5 aircraft and 490 personnel to Saudi Arabia, with additional jets staging through Incirlik, Turkey, and Keflavik, Iceland, to maintain NATO coverage simultaneously. The logistics of this split were brutal. The Air Force owned 34 E-3s total. NATO's operational plans required a minimum of 8 aircraft available in Europe at all times. Central Command wanted continuous 24-hour orbits over Saudi Arabia immediately, which demanded a minimum of 4 aircraft on station in rotation. 2 flying, 1 launching, 1 recovering, plus spares for maintenance downtime. The math didn't work. Lieutenant General Charles Horner, who as Joint Force Air Component Commander would orchestrate the entire air war, later wrote in Every Man a Tiger that his initial AWACS allocation felt like trying to cover Texas with 2 police helicopters. He asked for more. Tactical Air Command sent what it could. By October, 7 E-3s were operating from Riyadh, with 3 more rotating through on 30-day deployments. The remaining 24 covered everything else on the planet. What Horner's staff built during those 5 months of Desert Shield was not a deployment in any conventional sense. It was an architecture. Orbiting radar platforms, communications relays, ground-based fusion centers, and a web of procedural agreements tied them together at a scale never attempted outside a NATO exercise. Each E-3 orbit was assigned a geographic sector and a tactical call sign. The western orbit, covering the Iraqi border with Jordan and the Scud launch zones in the H2/H3 airfield complex, was Cougar. The central orbit over northern Saudi Arabia was Bulldog. The eastern orbit, covering Kuwait and the Persian Gulf, was Buckeye. A fourth orbit, added later for the Maritime Coordination Mission, worked with Navy E-2C Hawkeyes to deconflict carrier-based aviation from Air Force strike packages. A task that sounds administrative until you realize that a single identification error could put an American missile into an American aircraft. The deconfliction problem requires a brief detour. It exposed a flaw that almost nobody talks about. The E-3's identification friend or foe system relied on Mode 4 encrypted transponder interrogation, a system designed during the Cold War to distinguish NATO aircraft from Soviet ones. It worked fine in that binary scenario. In a coalition of 34 nations flying over 100 different aircraft types, many carrying incompatible or outdated IFF transponders, Mode 4 became a guessing game. Saudi F-15S carried American IFF. British Tornadoes carried a NATO-compatible variant. French Jaguars carried their own system. Several coalition partners flew aircraft that didn't respond to Mode 4 interrogation at all, making them indistinguishable from Iraqi contacts on the AWACS scope. The 552nd's weapons directors developed ad hoc procedural fixes, geographic kill boxes, altitude blocks, mandatory check-in frequencies that were essentially workarounds for a technological failure. Colonel Jim Grooney, the senior AWACS mission crew commander during Desert Shield, described the IFF situation to Air Force historian Dr. Diane Putney as the single biggest risk to fratricide in the theater. That assessment, published in Putney's Air Power Advantage, Planning the Gulf War, Air Campaign 1989 to 1991, was largely ignored in the post-war celebration. The fratricide problem it described would resurface in every coalition conflict that followed. Back to the architecture. By January 15, 1991, the UN deadline for Iraqi withdrawal, the AWACS network had flown over 2,000 Desert Shield sorties and tracked more than 120,000 aircraft movements without a single mid-air collision or friendly fire incident in the air control system. The maintenance crews, who had been mocked for a decade, found a rhythm in the desert, pushing mission-capable rates above 80% through cannibalized parts, 16-hour shifts, sheer institutional stubbornness, and a supply chain held together by personal relationships with depot contacts back in Oklahoma. The aircraft that couldn't sustain NATO sortie rates in peacetime was sustaining combat sortie rates in a theater where the nearest depot was 7,000 miles away. Nobody in Congress was watching the maintenance logs yet. They would be. "We owned the sky from the first minute," Lieutenant General Charles Horner told Air Force interviewer Dr. Suzanne Gary in a 1992 oral history recorded at Langley Air Force Base. AWACS didn't just support the air campaign. AWACS was the air campaign. At 0238 hours on January 17, 1991, the first coalition strike packages crossed into Iraqi airspace. Aboard the Bulldog orbit, E-3, call sign Cougar, on the western station had launched 40 minutes earlier. 17 crew members stared at scopes that were about to become the busiest displays in the history of aerial warfare. In the first 24 hours of Desert Storm, AWACS controllers managed over 2,240 coalition sorties. Not sequentially, simultaneously. At peak tempo, a single weapons director might be tracking 40 to 60 friendly aircraft in his sector while monitoring Iraqi fighter activity across a 200 nautical mile arc, issuing threat calls, altitude deconflictions, tanker assignments, and combat vectors? On voice radio, in real time, while the CC-2 mission computer refreshed the tactical picture every 10 seconds as the rotodome completed each sweep. The Iraqi Air Force had roughly 750 combat aircraft at the start of hostilities. On paper, this was a credible force. MiG-29 Fulcrums, MiG-25 Foxbats, Mirage F-1s, MiG-23 Floggers, with pilots who had logged thousands of hours during the Iran-Iraq War. What they did not have was situational awareness. Iraqi ground-controlled intercept stations, the Soviet-model radar network that directed their fighters, were among the first targets hit by F-117 stealth strikes and Tomahawk cruise missiles. Within hours, Iraqi pilots were launching blind, climbing into airspace where AWACS had already painted them at 200 miles and vectored F-15Cs to intercept before the MiGs even knew they were being hunted. The kill chain was lopsided to the point of absurdity. An AWACS weapons director would detect the Iraqi aircraft on radar, classify it as hostile using track behavior and geographic filtering. Since coalition aircraft were confined to assigned corridors, anything maneuvering outside those corridors in Iraqi airspace was presumptively hostile. Then vector the nearest F-15 onto an intercept heading with range, bearing, altitude, and closure rate updates every few seconds. Captain Steve Tate of the 71st Tactical Fighter Squadron scored the first Air Force air-to-air kill of the war at 03:15 hours on January 17th, downing an Iraqi Mirage F-1 with an AIM-7M Sparrow. His AWACS controller had called the bandit at 60 miles and guided Tate through a geometry that put the Mirage nose on at optimal Sparrow launch parameters. Tate fired once. The entire engagement, from initial AWACS call to missile impact, lasted less than 90 seconds. Captain Rory Drager, another 71st TFS pilot, got his kill minutes later under identical AWACS direction, a second Mirage F-1. Same geometry, same result. A digression on what the Iraqis were actually facing because it matters for understanding why 41 kills happened and 0 coalition air-to-air losses occurred. The MiG-29, Iraq's best fighter, carried an N019 Rubin radar with a detection range against fighter-sized targets of roughly 45 nautical miles in optimal conditions. The E-3's AN/APY-2 was tracking those same MiG-29s at over 4 times that distance. By the time an Iraqi pilot's radar could theoretically detect the F-15 bearing down on him, the F-15 had already received 6 or 7 AWACS updates, locked on with its own AN/APG-70, and was seconds from weapons release. The MiG-29 is a superb dogfighter inside 10 nautical miles. Iraqi MiG-29s never got within 10 nautical miles of anything. Over 43 days, the E-3 fleet flew 379 combat sorties and logged over 5,000 flight hours in theater. Every single one of the coalition's 41 air-to-air victories was achieved with AWACS support, not coincidentally, but structurally. The rules of engagement required AWACS confirmation before any beyond visual range shot. Weapons directors weren't optional participants in the kill chain. They were the kill chain's first link. Coalition aircraft flew over 116,000 sorties during the war. AWACS managed them all. 0 air-to-air fratricides occurred under AWACS control during the entire conflict. Congress had called the E-3 a procurement cautionary tale. It had just orchestrated the most one-sided air campaign since 1967. The platform that couldn't hold a 60% readiness rate at Tinker held an 85% rate in a combat zone. And the radar that maintenance crews cursed for a decade tracked every Iraqi fighter that dared take off. Most of them only took off once. At 03:47 hours on January 19, 1991, 50 hours into the air war, a DSP satellite in geosynchronous orbit over the Indian Ocean detected the infrared bloom of a Scud missile launch from western Iraq. The detection was real. The tracking data reached Central Command approximately 90 seconds later. By then, the Scud was already in its ballistic arc, beyond interception by any air asset, and the satellite's contribution to the engagement was functionally a notification that something bad had already happened. This was the alternative that was supposed to replace AWACS. The satellite advocates of the mid-1980s had made a seductive case. Space-based radar could cover vast areas without fuel costs or crew fatigue, and it eliminated the maintenance nightmares entirely. No ethylene glycol lines to crack. No rotodome drive mechanisms to seize. The problem. And it was a problem the Defense Science Board study had glossed over with elegant vagueness, was temporal resolution. A satellite in low Earth orbit passes over a given point once every 90 to 120 minutes. A satellite in geosynchronous orbit stares continuously, but from 22,236 miles away, where the physics of radar aperture make tracking a single fighter-sized target somewhere between impractical and impossible with 1990s technology. The E-3 orbited at 29,000 feet, refreshed its picture every 10 seconds, and could tell a weapons director whether a contact 180 miles away was climbing, descending, turning left, or accelerating. In real time, continuously, for 8 hours per sortie. Dr. John Ensminger, who directed DARPA's airborne surveillance programs through the late 1980s, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in 1991 that space-based radar capable of replicating AWACS track quality against airborne targets was, at minimum, 2 decades and $40 billion away. As of 2024, that capability still does not exist in operational form. Ground radar fared no better under scrutiny. The AN/TPS-43, upgraded or not, sat on the surface. Its radar horizon against a low-flying aircraft at 200 feet altitude was roughly 18 nautical miles. Basic geometry, the curvature of the Earth, doesn't negotiate. The E-3 at patrol altitude pushed that horizon past 250 nautical miles for medium-altitude targets. During Desert Storm, Iraqi pilots who survived the first week learned to fly low, hugging the terrain to avoid detection. Ground-based radar lost them in the clutter and the curvature. AWACS looked down on them from 5 miles up and tracked them anyway, which was the entire reason pulse Doppler airborne radar had been invented in the first place. General Merrill McPeak, Air Force Chief of Staff during the war, addressed this directly in his 1992 briefing to the Air Force Association. "Ground radar gave us a fence," he said. "AWACS gave us a dome." The fighter radar argument was subtler and harder to dismiss. The F-15C's AN/AP G70 was an exceptional air-to-air radar, 80 nautical miles of detection range against a fighter target in track-while scan mode, with the ability to guide multiple AIM-7 Sparrows simultaneously. Why not just let the fighters find their own targets? Because a fighter radar looks where the nose points. An F-15 scanning for threats ahead cannot simultaneously monitor the airspace behind it, beside it, or 150 miles to its left, where an Iraqi MiG-29 has just lit afterburners heading for a coalition tanker orbit. On the night of January 19th, AWACS controller Captain Kevin Kasa McLaughlin aboard the Cougar orbit detected 2 Iraqi Mirage F-1s heading south toward a KC-135 refueling track. The nearest F-15 CAP was oriented northeast, scanning Iraqi airspace along its assigned threat axis. McLaughlin's scope showed both pictures simultaneously. He turned the F-15 flight 90 degrees to the southwest, called the Mirages at 85 miles, and the engagement ended with 2 kills before the tanker crew ever knew they were being targeted. No fighter radar in the world could have seen both sides of that geometry at once. The 1986 Defense Science Board had recommended diminishing marginal returns on AWACS investment. In 43 days over Iraq, the platform those analysts had written off managed 116,000 sorties, enabled 41 air-to-air kills, and lost 0 coalition aircraft to friendly fire under its control. The satellites watched from 22,000 miles away. Ground radars stared at the horizon, and fighter radars looked where they were pointed. AWACS looked everywhere, all the time, and told everyone what it saw. The $2.7 billion upgrade Congress had agonized over worked out to about $23,000 per sortie managed. A single F-15 cost $43 million. Somewhere over Afghanistan in October 2001, an E-3B weapons director was managing close air support for Special Forces teams in the Panjshir Valley while simultaneously deconflicting Navy F-14s out of carriers in the Arabian Sea, Air Force F-15ES staging from Al Udeid, and CIA-operated Predator drones that weren't on anybody's air tasking order. The AWACS crew had been airborne for 14 hours. The mission computer was running software that had last received a major update in 1996. The rotodome was the same basic Westinghouse design that had first flown in 1975. And there was no replacement, no alternative architecture that could do what that aircraft was doing over the Hindu Kush, because nobody had ever built one. The post-Desert Storm years should have been a victory lap. Instead, they became a stress test. Bosnia in 1993 through 1995 put AWACS over the Adriatic to enforce the no-fly zone over the former Yugoslavia. Operation Deny Flight, 69,000 sorties managed over 2 years. Kosovo in 1999 added Operation Allied Force, where E-3s coordinated NATO strike packages against Serbian air defenses while managing a politically fractured coalition that made Desert Storm's 34-nation IFF headache look simple. Serbia operated the same Soviet export air defense systems that Iraq had used, but in terrain that was mountainous, forested, and far less forgiving of radar geometry. The E-3 and its crews adapted. The airframe groaned. By 2005, the average E-3 in the Air Force inventory was 28 years old. The 707 airframe had been out of Boeing production since 1991, which meant structural spare parts were being sourced from aircraft boneyards and, in at least one documented case, from a commercial scrapyard in the Mojave Desert. The Air Force's own 2006 aging aircraft study, compiled by the Air Force Materiel Command at Wright-Patterson, noted that corrosion on E-3 wing spars had reached levels requiring individual aircraft structural audits, language that translates in plain English to checking whether each airplane's wings were still safe to fly. Readiness rates that had surged to 85% during Desert Storm settled back into the mid-60s. The maintenance crews at Tinker were fighting the same cooling system battles they'd fought in 1984, plus 2 new enemies, metal fatigue and obsolescence. Circuit cards for the CC-2 mission computer were no longer manufactured. When one failed, technicians repaired it by hand, component by component, under magnification. The aircraft kept deploying. Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch over Iraq through the 1990s, enduring freedom in Afghanistan starting in 2001. Iraqi freedom in 2003, where E-3s managed the air campaign over Baghdad with the same orbit structure, Cougar, Bulldog, Buckeye, that had been invented in a Saudi planning room 13 years earlier. The 552nd Air Control Wing, redesignated from its earlier incarnation, flew continuous combat rotations for over a decade without a single year off. Crew members who had deployed for Desert Storm as junior airmen came back as senior NCOs, training replacements on systems older than the trainees themselves. The Air Force announced the E-3's replacement in 2023, the E-7A Wedgetail, based on a Boeing 737-700 airframe carrying the Northrop Grumman multi-role electronically scanned array radar, would take over the airborne early warning mission starting in the late 2020s. The initial contract, awarded to Boeing, was valued at $1.2 billion for the first 2 aircraft. Full fleet replacement of 26 E-7As is projected to cost north of $20 billion at current estimates. Congressional critics have already raised concerns about cost growth. The Government Accountability Office flagged schedule risk in a 2024 report. The cycle, as anyone who has read this far can probably sense, is repeating with mechanical precision. The Wedgetail's Mesa radar is a fixed, active electronically scanned array. No rotating rotordome, no mechanical drive assembly, none of the 15-year maintenance curse that had plagued the APY-2. It scans 360 degrees electronically, with beam steering agility that the AN/APY-2's mechanical rotation could never match. On paper, it is everything the E-3 should have been if 1970s technology had allowed it. Whether it will work as advertised in contested airspace against peer adversaries with electronic warfare capabilities that Iraq never possessed is a question the Air Force cannot answer yet. That file stays classified, and some of the testing hasn't happened. What has happened is a quiet bureaucratic act that closes a 40-year loop. In 2022, the Air Force declassified portions of the 1986 Defense Science Board Review, the one that recommended shifting investment away from AWACS towards satellites and ground-based alternatives. Appended to the declassified version was a 1992 addendum, written after Desert Storm, that had never been released. The addendum, authored by two of the original panel members, recommended indefinite continuation of the AWACS program at full operational capability. The phrase diminishing marginal returns did not appear. Captain Mike Kimo Knapp, the weapons director from that first night over Iraq, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2012. His 9-inch scope has been replaced by color multifunction displays. The voice calls haven't changed. On an E-7 test flight over the Gulf of Mexico in early 2024, a Boeing test crew ran a simulated combat scenario using the same tactical vocabulary: bulldog, declare, hostile, engage, that Knapp used at 0300 hours on January 17, 1991. The radar was new, the grammar was identical.